If you decided that you were going to sit down and create a collage of every person who died due to violence, you would quickly realize you wouldn't have enough space. The faces of the victims would create a sea that was never ending. In most cases, victims just become a statistic, another number at the end of the year of the people who lost their life. The truth is that for every face, there's a story. Some of the stories run long. Some people live full lives. But then you have stories of those who were cut short, like this next story. A story of a victim that was 12 years old. A girl who was born and raised in St. James Parish, Louisiana, a small community. And whenever tragedy hits a small community, people seem to come together. In this case, they would come together to look for a missing person. A girl who went by the name of Talaija Dorsey. Sadly, when the search concluded, it would end in heartbreak, and the area of St. James Parish, Louisiana, would never be the same.
December 31st, 2001. The world would make way for Talaija Dorsey. She would be born to her father, Terrence Dorsey, and her mother, Emma Smith. The place she called home would be St. James Parish, located in Louisiana. As a toddler, things didn't work out between her parents, so they would ultimately separate. However, by the time she was 4, her mother would meet a new man, and from then on, she would be raised in the household with her mother, her other siblings, and her stepfather. Talaija Dorsey is described as someone who was sweet, caring, someone who enjoyed dancing and flipping around the house. She also enjoyed music and hanging out with family and friends. From the perspective of her neighbors' eyes, she was a bundle of joy, someone who brought joy to their little community. Talaija's teachers describe her as smart, someone who was eager to learn. While in school, she dabbled in a few extracurricular activities, such as cheerleading, something that she enjoyed very much. Like a lot of young children, Talaija had dreams that would often change. At one point in her life, she wanted to be a nurse, but one thing that remained consistent was her telling her family members that she would be famous. She didn't know whether this would come from singing, dancing, acting, or anything of that sort of nature. But she knew one thing: she wanted the entire world to know her name. Fast forward to the summer of 2014, and Talaija is now 12 years old. It's summertime, so school is out. This is the time for fun. Have all the fun you can before school lets in before the fall. But she was excited for the next year because she would be a 7th grader at St. James High School. It was one of those high schools that ran from 7th to 12th grade, not a middle school. So although she was technically a middle schooler, she's considered a high schooler, at least at this school, and she was ready for it. Sadly, when school began that year, her homeroom class would be -1. A tragic event would occur that would claim the life of 12-year-old Talaija Dorsey. And instead of her mother doing the normal routine, going to the mall and stores and preparing for school, she would be preparing a funeral. Tuesday, July 1st, 2014. This day was especially exciting for Talaija because on this morning, she was set to go to a summer camp. So on that morning, her friend would come over in order to greet her, and they would go to this summer camp together. However, upon her friend coming over to her house and her mother checking inside of her room, Talaija Dorsey was nowhere to be found. Upon learning that Talaija wasn't inside of a room, her mother would immediately canvass the immediate area. However, upon searching, she still couldn't be found. So she would call around to a few relatives that lived nearby and ask them if they had seen her. But they too as well didn't know where she was. Having exhausted all options, her mother would finally decide to contact the authorities and officially report 12-year-old Talaija Dorsey missing. After receiving the call, officers would be dispatched to their home, and after arriving, they would quickly learn that Talaija Dorsey wasn't prone to running away, and this was completely outside of her character. Her mother would testify to the authorities that even if she was mad and threatened to run away, when they went to look for her, she was no further than the front or the backyard. So the fact that she's missing now is a huge red flag. After learning the details of the case, the authorities would waste no time jumping into motion. They would immediately organize a search. They would search the immediate area in hopes to find her safe. While a few officers immobilized and began searching the area, one of the detectives would begin questioning family and friends. After interviewing everyone close to her and the day closed out, by the end of the night, they were no closer to finding Talaija. Whenever the authorities are searching for a child, those first few hours are very important. But in this situation, those first few hours had passed. And it's a proven fact that the more time that passes, the more dangerous it becomes for the person missing. The night of July 1st of 2014 would slowly make way for the morning of July 2nd. Overnight, the authorities had begun to check out alibis and rerun stories. But while checking the alibis, they would realize that one alibi that was given stood out. An alibi that was given by her stepfather. Her stepfather was then 43-year-old John Celestine. When questioned by the authorities about the whereabouts of Talaija, he told the authorities that when she went missing, he was most likely at work. But, like the authorities do, they went to check out his alibi, and turns out he wasn't. Aside from saying he was at work, he gave a few other statements that the police would come to find non-credible. After learning that John Celestine had basically lied about a few events, the day after Talaija went missing, he would be arrested. He would be booked into the local jail on false communications and obstruction of justice. Normally in these situations, someone close to the person missing would be given the benefit of the doubt. Someone like a stepfather. But in this case, something didn't sit right with the authorities about John Celestine, so they decided to book him on those charges just in case. John Celestine is now officially a person of interest. But even if he is the culprit, Talaija is actively missing. And although they had a person of interest, they were no closer to finding where she was. So, like the authorities do in this situation, they would throw a Hail Mary. They would reach out to the local media in hopes to get the story out. They were hoping that when the story aired, it would generate leads. Because as of this point, they have a missing 12-year-old girl with no clues about her whereabouts.
Here's a recap. Talaija was last seen by family members Tuesday morning. Her mother's fiance, John Celestine, is in jail in connection with the case, charged with obstruction of justice. And tonight, officials explain why their search is focusing more and more on his moves the morning of the child's disappearance.
Even if, God, she's not alive, I just need to know. The not knowing is killing me.
Talaija Dorsey's mother, Emma Smith, wants answers. In the days since her daughter went missing, she says her mind has wandered to the worst places.
It goes all over the place. Just, you could think the worst. You hope for the best, but you always have the worst in the back of your mind.
Investigators are also holding on to hope.
We hopeful that she ran away. We hopeful somebody helped her get out of town. And, you know, for whatever reason, you know, she's not communicating with us. But realistically, too, we're very concerned. Time, you know, a lot of time has passed since we started looking for her.
St. James Sheriff Willie Martin says deputies are focusing more and more on John Celestine, Emma Smith's fiancé. They have yet to identify him as a suspect. However, he's being held on obstruction charges in the case.
Mr. Celestine has not been totally honest with us when we were, you know, started this process and gathering information from him, and our focus is still on him, but we still not ignoring other information that's coming in from the public.
Today, their search took them back to parts of St. James on lesser traveled roads, including rural routes along Highway 3127. It's Celestine's daily route to work.
We were right now regrouping and revisiting where we think routes he may have taken as he moved around that morning.
Investigators have processed evidence collected in Celestine's cars and the home he shared with Talaija and her family, but the sheriff says they found nothing that would incriminate him in this case. Now, anyone with information on Talaija Dorsey's disappearance is asked to call authorities. You can make an anonymous tip by calling 1-855-TIPS-247 or texting TIP SJPSO to 888-777. And Crime Stoppers is also now offering a $2,500 reward for information that leads to the arrest of a person or persons responsible for her disappearance.
After the story aired, it would do the tricks. The police would begin receiving tips, as well as the community beginning to immobilize. In addition to the local authorities, over 100 citizens would form a group, and they would all go out and begin to search for Talaija Dorsey. They would search wooded areas, grassy areas, abandoned homes. But even with all the manpower, they still weren't able to find her. As far as the tips that the authorities were receiving, the tips would come in, but none of them would pan out. They were essentially back at square one every time they investigated a tip. July 3rd of 2014 would come and go, and then July 4th. While other families were congregating and barbecuing, enjoying each other's company, the family of Talaija was still searching for her. When the last firework went up in the sky on the night of July 4th, Talaija still hadn't returned home. And by July 5th, the people close to her had begun to accept the fact that something sinister may have happened. Although her stepfather is still in custody, by this point, he stopped talking to authorities. But just because he stopped talking doesn't mean he can't provide any information. They had confiscated his cell phone and began to look at GPS records. While looking at his GPS records, they would notice that he went to an odd area, so they would form a search there. And on July 6th of 2014, the records would lead them to a secluded area located shortly away from a highway. In fact, the area that they were led to was at the edge of a sugarcane field. Authorities would testify that upon entering this field, they would begin to get an eerie feeling. Along this search, the authorities would bring cadaver dogs, although after entering the area, they would quickly come to realize that the dogs weren't needed because there was a stench in the air, a smell that a seasoned investigator was used to. Shortly into the search, the authorities would come across the body of a young victim, a young female. This victim would, in fact, be identified as 12-year-old Talaija Dorsey.
Good evening, I'm Gina Swanson, and tonight we begin with breaking news out of St. James Parish. Officials say after almost a week of searching, they have found the body of 12-year-old Talaija Dorsey. Her body was recovered in a sugarcane field. WDSU reporter Travers Mackel joins us live from Vacherie with more. Travers.
Gina, it's the news that nobody here wanted. The sheriff confirmed today that 12-year-old Talaija Dorsey's body was found near a sugarcane field near Vacherie. Obviously, we all know by now that authorities and the general public have been looking for this little girl for about a week. She went missing on Tuesday. The cause of death at this time, according to the sheriff, is not known, but the sheriff tells us that he found the girl himself. He has been one of the many people in this community out looking for this little girl since she went missing. We do have video of many people in this community walking around using four-wheelers, doing whatever they could to try to find this little girl. Once again, the cause of death not known. An autopsy will be done sometime tomorrow, but the sheriff tells us this is being considered a homicide. The victim's family completely distraught. When we caught up with them earlier this afternoon, they tell us this was the worst news that the mother and the rest of the family could receive.
Shocked, disappointed. We didn't think we were going to find her like that, but we prayed and we asked God to give her back to us either way, and this was his way of giving her back to us.
Took it personally. That's really all I can say. I had a personal vested interest in this, of solving this, and took this picture home with me every day, put it on my kitchen table, and left with it in the morning. And my guys could tell you, I worked as many hours and minutes that they did, and I was determined to bring this case to closure. And it didn't end the way we hoped and prayed it would end.
An autopsy would be conducted on the victim, but due to the state of the body, they weren't able to find out a cause of death. After finding Talaija, the authorities would home in even more on John Celestine, and after searching his vehicle, they would find a pair of her slippers inside of his work van, a van that was normally not at the house. At this point, the authorities have inconsistent statements. They also have a pair of her slippers inside of his work van. To some, that may not seem like a lot of evidence, but to the authorities, that was enough. And on July 8th of 2014, John Celestine would be formally indicted on charges of murder. After being indicted, John would declare his innocence, and he would prepare to take it to trial. Meanwhile, while John's being indicted, the mother of Talaija and her father are planning a funeral that would rock this city to its very foundation and make everyone around them hug their children just a little bit tighter.
A church packed full of grieving friends and family mourned the loss of Talaija Dorsey and celebrated the girl's life that was cut short.
It's very hard. She's just a baby. And for her to be taken away from us like this is just not right. That's the answer we all are looking for. Why? He raised this child. So why would you do this? What was going through his mind? What could have pushed him to this limit?
When John Celestine was indicted on charges of murder, he would begin playing a game with the court system. His lawyer would often put the case off, and this would drag on for a few years. But by 2018, John Celestine had received a court date. But a few days before court was set to begin, John would shock everyone. He would decide to plead guilty to a charge of murder. Instead of taking it to trial, he would plead guilty, and the judge would sentence him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even though he's been brought to justice, he never told what happened. There's a lot of speculation on what caused him to essentially plead guilty. But the number one theory is that He didn't want the true details to come out in court. Although they couldn't determine a cause of death for Talaija, they did find DNA evidence that suggested he had violated her. And that's a charge he didn't want to go to prison for. So, in exchange for pleading guilty to one count of murder, that charge would be dropped. He would essentially be hauled off to the local prison, where he is now serving his sentence. But again, the story has never been fully told. He hasn't told why he did it or what transpired. The authorities don't even know if the murder occurred at the site she was found in or whether she was dumped there. All they know is that John Celestine took her life. The life of 12-year-old Talaija Dorsey, a young child who was full of promise, hope, and ambition. And again, although he's been brought to justice, is it really justice when you don't know what truly happened? Rest in peace, Talaija Dorsey. Thank you for being a light for others.